But today we are going to jump back into the book of James. In fact, we've only got this week and next week's message left in the book of James. We'll be wrapping it up next week. And I hope it's been as much of a blessing to you as it has been to Nick and I. It's been an encouragement and a challenge to take a fresh look at this familiar book and to see how God wants us to have wisdom in all the situations of our lives. And today we are going to look at James give us some wisdom about how we can have more patience. And I expect that many people's ears perk up a little when they hear that. How many of us have wished for more patience numerous times in our lives? I've never met with a parent who's not asked for prayer to be more patient with their kids. Or maybe you've prayed for patience with your spouse or with other family members. Maybe you've prayed for patience with annoying people in your life. But I hate to disappoint. That's not the kind of patience we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the kind of patience we need when facing hardships in our lives that are out of our control. In last week's passage, we read James's warning to the rich people who were oppressing other people. These were landowners who exploited their workers to get more money for themselves. And many of these workers were part of the church communities that James was writing to. James called these rich people out for not paying their workers a fair wage, if any wage was paid at all. He calls them out for not treating their workers honorably and making them cry out to God. And he calls some of them out for condemning and murdering innocent people, even if they did it through legitimate ways like through the courts. So there were some people whom James was writing to who were going through a prolonged season of suffering. This was out of their control. They had no means of recompense. They had no means of protection from these oppressors. And many probably didn't even have any other options to earn money. And so James is writing to them to help them to have wisdom to how to be patient in these tough situations, to give them wisdom to endure, to give them wisdom to have that patience. So let me read the passage to you, and then we'll unpack the two pieces of wisdom that James is giving us today. And James will be in James chapter 5, verses 7 through 12. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you'll be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you'll be condemned. So the first piece of wisdom that James gives us for patience is that we can be patient by looking forward. And we see this in verses 7 through 9, where James gives us 3 commands. In verse 7, he calls them to be patient. He calls them to stand firm in verse 8. And he calls them not to grumble against each other in verse 9. And the important thing to see is how James sets each of these commands in the context of the return of Jesus. Verse 7, be patient until the Lord's coming. Verse 8, stand firm because the Lord's coming is near. Verse 9, don't grumble against one another. The judge is standing at the door. James wants his readers to put their current hardships and their sufferings in the wider context of God's eternal plans. He wants them to take a step back from their trials and see them in the light of eternity. A few years back, we did a Christmas Day service where we had boxes on stage, and each box had an item in it that represented a gift we receive from God because of what happened at Christmas. And we invited one kid up to open the box over here, and inside was a massive rope. And I gave them the end of the rope and told them to walk all the way around. They walked down the side, along the back, down that side, and back up to the front. There was still rope left over in the box. And at the end of the rope, there was about a 1-inch piece of red tape. And that red tape represented the amount of time we have here on this earth, and the rest of the rope represented the amount of time we'll have in the new heavens and the new earth. And obviously that analogy breaks down because this rope ended somewhere at the bottom of the box. But eternity will never end. But the idea should be clear. Compared to the length of eternity, our life on this earth is just a blip. And the hardships that we face and the trials we encounter, even though they can be so hard for us in the moment, will seem like a distant memory when we spent 10,000 years in utter bliss in the presence of Jesus. But this can be really hard because our hardships are so present and often overwhelming. And eternity, even though it is forever, seems a distant way away. And if I can be real with you for a moment, I'd like to share about some suffering that I recently just went through. It actually culminated on Wednesday, in fact, because I'm a 6'4" guy, and on Wednesday I had to take a long-haul flight in economy class. Tragic, I know. The shorter folks out there might not understand the pain of what was going on, but if you're north of 6 foot, you feel me. I know you do. It was a 9-hour and 20-minute flight, and about the halfway point, my kids were sleeping, and I was actually working on this portion of the sermon. And as I was thinking through this idea of suffering on the plane, the lady in front of me decided to fully recline her chair, and the back of her chair was this far away from my face. I measured it so I could make sure to communicate that with you this morning. But do you know what kept me going? Do you know how I endured that agony? I knew that at the end of a long day of flying, I'd be lying in my own bed and be able to sleep the night away. And that thought for me was so sweet in the moment that it helped me endure the leg cramps, helped me endure the blurred vision, helped me endure the rising rage inside of me. Now, I'm hamming it up a bit, obviously, but this is the same for our actual suffering. I was able to be okay on the plane no matter how uncomfortable I was because I knew it was only temporary. And James wants us to set our hearts and our minds in the eternal reality of our faith to help us recognize that the sufferings we face in this life, which might last years rather than just hours on a plane, that those sufferings are still only temporary, especially when compared to all of eternity. And so with that eternal reality in mind, James gives us these 3 commands. He calls them to be patient. The word literally means long suffering, to suffer long. I don't know about you, but when suffering comes in my life, I want to know how quickly it's going to be over. I want it to be suffering short, or if preferably not suffering at all, would be fine by me. But when James calls us to be patient, he wants us to have the attitude of being willing to suffer for a long time, even until the return of Christ. Verse 7, let me read it to you, and verse 8. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient. Here's another one of James's many illustrations that we've been looking at through this series. Israel was a heavily agricultural society. And before modern irrigation techniques and water storage techniques, they were 100% dependent on constant rainfall. A farmer would have his crops watered by the spring rains, and he'd hope that the wheat and the barley had received enough water to last through the drier summer season until the rain came again in the fall. We know, living in the Central Valley, what it's like to pray for rain. And I imagine many a Jewish farmer looking out over his fields through the dry summers and praying that rain would come soon. James' second command is for them to stand firm because the Lord's coming is near. This command carries the idea of shoring yourself up to withstand any storms that come in life. It's a picture of making sure our lives are on a steady foundation so that we can stand securely in the midst of hardships. And James again encourages us to do this because the Lord's coming is near. Now, the word near for us means it's coming next week or maybe next month. But for James, the word near is in the context of the whole stretch of eternity. And then the third command is not an encouragement, it's a correction. Do not grumble against one another. And at first it seems out of place compared to these other two commands. And I've been wondering why it's here. But I think it's a call for us not to be the source of one another's hardships and sufferings. Because we can't avoid facing hardships in our lives. So much is out of our control. But we can strive not to be the source of suffering for fellow believers in Christ. If we grumble against someone, we're causing drama in the church. We're creating division. We're creating strife amongst the people who should be our closest family. The church should be a safe place for believers to gather together and comfort one another as we go through the trials of this life together. But if the church becomes the source of those trials, it is all the more bitter. And James shows his level of seriousness with this by not only putting in light of the return of Christ, but in light of the coming judgment. James is saying that there'll be consequences for those who grumble and cause drama within the body of believers. And so James's first piece of wisdom for our patience is that we should look forward with a great desire to the return of Christ and the ushering in of his kingdom. Then James's second piece of wisdom is similar but opposite. We can be patient by looking back. Let me reread verses 10 and 11. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. So James is encouraging his readers to look back to the prophets of old, to get some examples of what it looks like to be patient through suffering. And by prophets, I think James is referring to all of the Old Testament, not just those who wrote the books that we call the prophets, because at some point, almost all the Old Testament authors were referred to as prophets. They are those who spoke in the name of the Lord and wrote down what was said. And one of the purposes of the Old Testament is to give us these examples of patience and of waiting on the Lord. It's not the only purpose that the Old Testament has, but whenever we read those books, we can be asking the question, how are these people demonstrating patience in the face of suffering? In fact, if you want to do a really interesting Bible study, look up all the times in the Old Testament people had to wait. Whether that's Abraham waiting for his promised son, Joseph waiting in prison, Moses and the people of Israel waiting in the wilderness, David waiting to become king after Saul, or the people waiting for the end of the exile. All these people had to exhibit patience. They had to suffer long. And James tells us that there are two main things that we should be learning about patience from these Old Testament stories. Firstly, he says, as you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. In these Old Testament stories, we're meant to understand that the end result of persevering in patience is blessing. Just take the story of Joseph, for example. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, but through his faithfulness was raised up in Potiphar's house. And then he was thrown into prison because he was falsely accused, but was raised up to help lead and take care of the prison. And then at just the right time, he was raised up to help save the nation of Egypt, but more importantly, save his brothers from the famine so that the people of God may continue. Huge blessing came from Joseph's patience. And James here references the story of Job. Job was a wealthy man who lost all his crops, he lost all his herds, he even lost his sons and daughters. But he didn't accuse God or curse God. Instead, he waited in mourning. And after many long conversations where he suffered under the accusation of his friends, God poured out blessing upon Job, and he became wealthier than he had been before and had a large family once again. This truth of blessing after suffering is something that Jesus saw in the Old Testament as well. We've said before in this series that James is just riffing on the teachings of his older brother, Jesus. And Jesus teaches a similar truth in his famous speech called the Beatitudes. We can be tempted to think that the Beatitudes were a new teaching of Jesus. But maybe these were Jesus' reflections on the truths he saw of how God treated his people in the Old Testament stories, which Jesus knew so well. Here's Matthew 5:10 through 12. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So in light of the persecutions and sufferings that his people will face, Jesus encourages us to look forward to our reward in heaven, and also remember that this is how the prophets before us were treated, looking forward and looking back. And when we are long-suffering, Jesus and James both say that we will be blessed. So that's the first truth we can learn from these Old Testament stories. Secondly, James says that we can learn that the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. A hugely pivotal story in the story of the Exodus, that's the story when God saved his people from Egypt, is when the people reject God's covenant and instead make a golden cow to worship in God's place. And God could have abandoned them at that moment. But instead, he renews his covenant with them through Moses. And God reveals his nature to Moses. He reveals his name to Moses. He says this in Exodus 34. The Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. This is one of the center points of Old Testament theology. And so many of the passages in the Old Testament point back to this, referring to God using these terms. This is how the people were to understand God in the context of their rebellion and his forgiveness for them. And there are countless times that God had every right to give up on the people of Israel or individuals within it. Abraham went through moments of great trust in the Lord, but then lots of moments when he tried to rely on himself, rejecting God's promises, rejecting God's faithfulness. Or you can just look at the whole book of Judges that we studied together earlier this year. Numerous times the people of Israel deserved for God to leave them. Even the leaders that God raised up to help his people got worse and worse. But God was always compassionate and merciful. Whenever people turned to him, he would welcome them and rescue them. We have certain sayings as Christians, don't we, that aim to comfort someone during hard times. One example is, when God closes a door, he opens a window. You know it. The sentiment is nice, but it's actually not a biblical truth, and its origins trace back to the musical, The Sound of Music. Bit of trivia for you right there. But rather than seeking to comfort his readers with sentiment, James rather wants them to anchor their hope in the truths of God as discovered in these stories of the Old Testament. That God is compassionate and merciful, and that those who remain patient will be blessed. These are encouragements and truths that we can build our lives upon. So James is seeking to give his readers some wisdom on how they can remain patient in the face of hardships that they face, especially when those hardships are out of their control. We've seen that he encourages them to look forward to eternity and put their struggles in the light of eternity. And he encourages them to look back and see how God has demonstrated his care in the stories of the Old Testament. And so the question I want us to reflect on as we close is this. What is your response in the face of hardships? What is your response in the face of hardships? Are you a grumbler? When tough times come in your life, do you immediately go into complain mode? Why is this happening to me? I do all this good stuff, and yet why am I the one who has to go through this tough time? Haven't I gone through enough already? This can be such a tempting response. Our hardships hurt. They can cause us physical and emotional pain. And we don't feel like we've done anything to deserve it. And suffering can be particularly hard if our view of God is that he's a giant piñata in the sky that we whack with our prayers until goodies fall out. While we never put it so bluntly, when we grumble in the face of suffering, we're saying that God isn't doing a good job of taking care of us. But maybe you're not a grumbler. Maybe you're a hider. Your response is like that of the cartoon ostrich who digs his head into the sand to avoid pain. But instead of sand, you bury your face into a cell phone screen, constantly distracting your mind, scrolling through your news feed, so you don't have to face the hard realities of life. Or maybe you hide behind the TV screen, not literally, especially if you've got a wall-mounted TV, there's not a lot of room to squeeze in back there. But to avoid the pain of your situation, and rather than turning to God, you distract and entertain your brain with one show after another, and then another dozen after that. Or maybe you hide behind your job. Maybe your home life is tough for whatever reason. Or there are situations you don't want to face, so you decide to bury yourself in your work. But maybe you're not a hider or a grumbler. Maybe you're a fixer-upper. This is me all day long. When trials come, it's time to roll up your sleeves. They're already rolled up, ready for action. Maybe put on some battle paint and go to work. No matter the problem, I can fix it. There's a strategy and a path to overcome this difficulty, and all it takes is a positive mental attitude and a can-do spirit. Relying on God and being dependent on prayer are not really that necessary when you're a fixer-upper, because you can do it. Any other fixer-uppers out there? My experience is that I usually end up making things worse rather than better when I go into fixer-upper mode. I mean, imagine how different the story of Job would have been if Job had been a fixer-upper. He would have grieved for his kids for a while, but then he'd gone and got a manual labor job, trying to earn some cash until he'd earned enough to buy his first couple of sheep. He could have traded the wool, maybe got a friend's ram to help his sheep have lambs, and then he's starting to grow his own little herd. Then he could sell some of those sheep, buy some cattle, breed those, and he'd be back on his feet in no time. But thankfully, we have the example of Job in the Bible and not the example of Andy. He suffered long and waited for God to bring about his blessing. And so rather than being a grumbler or a hider or a fixer-upper, when we face hardships, God wants us to be a waiter. Not the guy in the tux at a fancy restaurant, but someone who waits on the Lord. Someone who relies on God. Someone who depends on God, trusting that he will work in his timing. But waiting is hard. I have a 3-year-old who hates waiting for anything. Whenever we tell him he needs to wait, he says, it's too hard waiting. And it is. It's too hard waiting. But James wants us to have wisdom to grow our waiting muscle, to grow our patience muscle. And we can do that by looking to God's faithfulness in the past. Not just looking back to the stories of the Old Testament, but we can also look back in our own lives and remember how God has been faithful in the past. If you remember when the Israelites crossed over the River Jordan into the Promised Land, they set up 12 stones as a reminder to themselves and future generations of God's faithfulness. And we should have our own pile of mental rocks, which we should add to whenever we see God demonstrate his compassion and mercy in our lives. And we can also grow our waiting muscle by looking forward with anticipation to our eternal reality. We can look forward and long for the day when we will see Jesus face to face, when we'll be with him in heaven, and all the sufferings of this life will be gone. It's never a waste of time to reflect on our eternal home. In fact, the more we reflect on our future with Jesus, the more useful we'll be for him in this life. It's when we get too focused on this world that our usefulness wanes. And one of the great ways that we can focus on heaven is by singing songs that focus our hearts and our minds in that future place. And so we're going to end our time together this morning with such a song. This song will be a new song to many of you, though if we've sung it a couple of times at Sam's Club, so if you're a Sam's Club goer, you may have heard this. And this is a song that we plan on introducing to the church soon, but rather than the band coming up to play it this morning, we're just going to play the recording of it with the lyrics on the screen. So feel free as you remain seated to sing along, but also feel free just to sit and reflect on the lyrics that will be there. That those lyrics that encourage us that this life is only temporary, whereas our true home is forever. So we'll play this song, and then after this song, I'll come back to pray us out.